So, hello and welcome to the Sexient Being Sessions. I am Alex Pruitt, a certified sex, love, and relationship coach and reality guide. I work with men, women, and couples plus who want to transform their old patterns, pain, and beliefs so they can create thriving relationships that are deeply connected, playful, and fulfilling within themselves and with others. Today, I'm joined by the lovely Rachel Rose. You want to go ahead and introduce yourself, Rachel Rose?
Yes, I am Rachel Rose, and I am a holistic psychologist and life coach. I work primarily with women who have gone through domestic abuse or have PTSD to help them reestablish themselves in life, themselves, and heal in any way that they feel they need to do that.
Beautiful. All right. So today our topic is abuse in relationships. And this can definitely be a heavy topic.
Hmm.
Um, I know I definitely had a lot of different ideas and even past experiences trickling in throughout the week. Um, yeah, so I don't know if you want to get things started, or if not, I'm happy to.
Um, why don't you go first?
So I think for me, some of the bigger pieces with abuse in relationships was
Hmm.
in my own journey, I actually didn't recognize what
Hmm.
abuse was unless it was in extremes,
Yes, that's
right?
very
So
clear. Yeah, same.
so I only saw abuse as being that, like, oh, somebody's being beaten physically or like screamed at regularly and called names, right? It
Mhm.
wasn't the lower levels of that. And so, like, during that, I ended up going through a few different abusive relationships through my adult life. And as that abuse came to a more escalated level, to where it actually involved like a partner putting me on the floor at one point in time. Like it felt so confusing and out of nowhere, even though now realizing like what abuse patterns look like, I realized there were other things there. Those were just the big moments, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. While you were saying that, I was thinking back on all of my past relationships, and I could confidently say there has been abuse in every single one of them in my past relationships, and not all of them were these drastic forms of abuse.
Hmm.
Some of them, sure. Um, and I remember telling myself in every single one of those relationships that it wasn't abuse because they weren't, they didn't hit me. It's only abuse if they hit me. Um, and then, learning and becoming a healer and psychologist that I am now, I'm hyper aware of all of the different types of abuse that can come in all its different forms. And in one of my past relationships, one of the biggest forms of abuse that came with him was neglect.
Yeah.
And I used to, tell myself, oh, that's the only healthy relationship I've ever been in. But looking back on it, that's one of the most, let me rephrase that. That relationship made me feel the least safe emotionally.
Hmm.
And I think it's because it came, the other ones, there were other forms of abuse. So we go into survival modes in a lot of our, we don't consciously realize that every single time.
Hmm.
But in that one, I felt the most unsafe because this person presented so beautifully, but then would never show up for me and my needs. And when my needs were brought up, that's when it got genuinely abusive. My needs were, too much, or I'm being needy. or, you know, I'm blowing things out of proportion by trying and voicing my boundaries and my needs in the relationship.
Yeah, and I think that piece of um, where you're actually using your voice to state what your boundaries are because that's something you're wanting to share with your partner, right? So they
Hmm.
can see you, hear you, understand you, love you in that, right?
Yeah.
Where that gets the retorts, right? The
Hmm.
arguments that they aren't valid or okay on whatever level is really that like some of those baseline foundations of abuse
Yeah.
happening in relationships.
Yeah.
And to me, that's where I can see where that's happened and like why that was able to transmute in my own life based on childhood experiences,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And
And
yeah.
oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, and in that specific example, like if anyone who's listening wants to know a little bit more of the technicalities of that, that form of abuse would classify as more of like a gaslighting,
Hmm.
is a that, you know, the person you're expressing yourself to is projecting all of the issue back onto you.
Yeah. Well, and that's I think one of my bigger like aha moments, right? And this was actually only in the last couple of years where I've very specifically been on this self work and healing journey for 6 very dedicated years. Um, was recognizing how me feeling confused
Mhm.
in relationship to another person
Mhm.
highly contributed to, or like it was a signal for me that there was something not okay and like misaligned in what was going on for communication. Um,
Mhm.
one of the first places I recognized it, it was actually a conversation with one of my parents, and I asked them a question about an action they took when I was a little kid, as far as me going to counseling or therapy or something along those lines. And it wasn't like asking for how they felt on it or anything like that. It was literally just like, oh, did you enroll me in this thing when I was a kid? Right.
Mhm. Mhm.
And it completely like twisted, like I kind of felt like I had whiplash in my body, like getting like whipped back and forth, where it like twisted around. And now all of a sudden it was about my other biological parent and how they were made to do this thing by them. And I was just like, okay, whoa, whoa, that wasn't even what I asked, right? And
Mm.
why is it
Mhm.
now going down this path? But I remember like going into this like state of confusion in my own body. And
Mhm.
then I left that place. And with where I was at in my processing at that point, I was able to notice the anger coming up in that instance when I separated myself from the situation. Like in my own experience, anger was made very unsafe early on as an expression from my
Ah,
my
yeah.
little kid body. And so
Mhm.
especially in interactions with my parents, it is very hard for me to connect with that space.
Mm.
But in that also has led to that compiling over the years to where with partnered relationships, and especially when you're bringing in that fear of abandonment and other
Mhm.
things, gets compiled and kind of like entangled in this messy web, right? To mean I'm not allowing myself to even notice when I was angry,
Mhm.
or that there was value in what that anger was trying to tell me, or
Yeah.
the confusion, or whatever the other emotion was.
Mhm. Yeah, gaining some modicum of emotional intelligence in your
Hmm.
experience. Yeah. And
Yeah.
you know that is I think one of the bigger issues that I deal with the women that I work with, um, is a lot of the time, especially when you're in abusive relationships, in the more cliche term of it, um, physical abuse or verbal or narcissistic abuse. Um,
Mhm.
there's this point in our healing where we have gotten to a place where that experience no longer rules over us. Like hands around your throat,
Mhm.
but it is still there in the shadows. So when you're finally feeling well enough within your being to go out and explore life again, explore your new hobbies or friendships or relationships, or you know talk to family.
Mhm.
And that's when the real healing of everything that happened in those abusive relationships, whatever relationship they may be, that's when the true healing really starts. And that's probably the more difficult one, is figuring out how that abuse has shaped you in your
Mhm.
relationship with yourself, so that you can interact with it, and have relationships externally as well. So like you were saying about the anger, like you set time aside, after that came up, um and you set aside time to personally process within yourself.
Yeah.
And I just want to urge and reiterate how important that is. And when you're not used to that, or you get stuck in a cyclical healing process that you believe for so long, that once I overcome my PTSD from this abuse, or my triggers, or this or that, recognizing red flags, then I'll be okay.
Yeah, because there's that idea that you've built enough boundaries, right? That
Yes.
you've built enough alarms in your system to
Mhm.
tell you. The thing is, those alarms were always there,
Mhm.
right? May have just not been listening. And that's to me where dissociation, the freeze
Mhm.
response, the fawn response really come
Mhm.
into play. And that's where to me that the levels of like being able to listen to the responses that are coming up in your body, like
Mhm.
getting in alignment with those sorts of communication are so important because
Mhm.
you can be dealing with chronic low back pain, which was mine, um, for years and decades, right?
Mhm.
And for me, it was this immense holding in my body at that point that ended up
Mhm.
showing up as not feeling accepted.
Mhm.
And that rooted back to a lot of stories within my family, but then also with partners and other places. I
Mhm.
ended up weirdly finding out, didn't know this beforehand, from a counselor I was working with at the time. And she was like, oh, I was doing a yoga like teaching class for her counseling practice. And
Mhm.
it's interesting that you say that this piece showed up in your low back because that part is very, like, physical body part is very associated with that space of acceptance.
Yeah.
And even when you go look at the chakra system and everything like that, that's the solar
Mhm.
plexus, or not solar plexus, sacral chakra. And that's
Yeah.
that is what that region is about, right? That low back
Mhm.
area in our body is very about those like foundational relationships with our family and our peer groups and our society.
Mhm.
But when you can
Yeah.
start learning to listen and communicate with yourself more fully, like it it carries those messages, whether that's your emotions or your primal body or whatever it is. We just learn to rationalize out of it,
Mhm.
which is
Yeah.
also another form of protection and safety. Like it has its place too, but Is it still serving you?
Mhm. Well, it's that's a somatics, and there's
Mhm,
I remember learning about that in my undergraduate when I was first studying psychology, and learning I studied both east to west philosophies and psychologies.
mhm,
So a lot of that was acupuncture or chakras like you just mentioned, and then also the Western science behind it as well, and
mhm.
the neurotransmitters, where you hold uh, the mind body medicine type of scenarios,
Yeah.
and it all comes back to the same place. Like you can call it woo woo, you can call it science. It's all the same.
Mhm.
Somatics. Um, the mind is very very powerful, and we also are emotion beings. And science has also, you know, proven. I don't want to say proven, but there's evidence suggesting, highly suggesting, heart brain. So
Mhm.
there's brain brain or mind brain or logic brain if you want to call it, and then there's heart brain. And heart brain is where the physical comes from. So when heartbreak happens, there's a reason it's called heartbreak. It's a physical reaction to a feeling, and it feels like your heart is being ripped out of you.
Yeah.
And that is genuinely happening. It's not just like in your mind and you're creating it. That is genuinely happening in your heart brain. And so when you are in an abusive situation, be it relationships or not, you have both of those brains going on. And so it can show up within the body.
Yeah.
So that is huge towards healing, especially from abuse, is we aren't really taught that you have to do both. You have to heal the body and the mind. And I think we mentioned this in our last session about intellectualizing healing, that we tend to just heal the mind part, the logic brain of that abuse, and we neglect the heart brain of it, which is the body part. And so and that's, in my personal opinion, and with the women that I've worked with, is the harder part, because that is allowing yourself to feel the panic attack or be
Mhm.
triggered and figure out where that trigger is coming from in your body. It's a lot of reliving some of the worst traumas you've had in your life. And that's hard. And so it is a little bit easier to, just teach yourself things to, and then intellectualize it, because it's less scary, at least in my opinion.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Mhm.
And I would have to say, like, even for the moments of chaos I went through, right, in the heartbreak of my marriage, because that was that big point that created this shift into my own
Mhm.
life, or my own like self-work path and
Mhm.
this healing process. Um, but with that, like, as painful as that space was, and uncomfortable as that space was, it was also far more scary to actually look at my own shit,
Oh
right? It
yeah.
was so easy to look at, oh, like, my ex-husband was an asshole, or this partner was an asshole, or they were just a piece of shit, and they were a cheater, or they were a liar, whatever it was.
Mhm.
But to actually look at my own patterns that allowed me to stay in those situations, which it felt too painful to
Mhm.
separate from them. Like, that's when you're in that, it doesn't feel like a choice,
No, no, it doesn't.
right?
Yeah.
It's it feels safer to stay with the thing that is so uncomfortable and already painful,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
because the unknown seems so much scarier.
Yeah. I like to call that staying in your own personal hell,
Mhm.
because it is, that is, you know it. You know hell like the back of your
Yeah.
hand, your own hell. But the idea of this unknown heaven, even if there is 100%, there's a billboard, on the road to heaven that says 100% healing guaranteed. 9 times out of 10 will still turn around and walk the other way
Yeah.
because it's scary and it's very real. And I urge anyone listening, don't do it alone. Seek out a professional in whatever medium that works for you. Communicate, and it might be 12 or 13 different interviews that you have or consultations that you have to find the right person for you. But trying to go into that space by yourself could be very dangerous, especially if you have trauma or PTSD of any kind.
Well, and one of the ways you'll hear me refer to it a lot is talking about modeling,
Hmm.
right? And that's one of the biggest ways we learn from the point in time we are born, right? Is by observation. It's by observing a model of the world around us.
Hmm.
And if you have fallen into abusive cycles and abusive patterns, and like whether you are the person giving or receiving those spaces,
Hmm.
you had a model, even if it was on very covert levels, that told you this was okay
Hmm.
for the way that you treated other people or that other people treated you.
Hmm.
And so when you're working with a coach or a trauma therapist or a specialist of some form,
Hmm.
they have this set of training so they can hold that space for you very safely,
Yeah.
right? So they can be this open and judgment-free zone so
Hmm.
you can explore and be seen, heard, understood, and even loved in your own experience, which then creates that this other new model for you.
Hmm.
And like you can read about this model in books and stuff, but it is very different when you actually get to see someone, hear someone, and you can use those mirror neurons to align with them, because if they are a good coach,
Hmm.
if they are a good therapist, they they're going to stay grounded in themselves
Yeah.
during a session. Like
Hmm.
they have done enough work in themselves that whatever you have coming up is not going to be too much for them.
Hmm.
And then they're going to bring forward tools to help you resource and step back into your empowerment so you can see where you have choice.
Hmm. And it's also, these coaches or therapists have the training and skill set to make sure that you're okay as well. As I know I'm in the PTSD spectrum, and when reliving a lot of the things that you've gone through that created that PTSD for you in your mind, it can create a panic attack in that moment. And so
Mhm.
the people that you're working with, the professionals, are able to make sure that that doesn't create re-traumatization.
Yes.
And that's also a perfect opportunity for us as healers and coaches and therapists to teach you how to combat that panic attack in that moment when it's happening, and so you're safe to even basically blow up.
Mhm.
Hmm.
Yeah. No, and that's it's that space where you get to like that you as the like client, right? You can
Hmm.
always speak up about if something feels
Yeah.
too much or too overwhelming. Like if a practitioner wants to take you through a practice and you're feeling completely off the wall dysregulated, you can always say no.
Oh, of
Um,
course, yes, and we
but
want that. Tell us, because if you don't
yes,
tell us, we won't know, and then we could damage you without even knowing.
well, and hopefully that practitioner, right, will celebrate the hell out of your no with you.
Yes, and if they don't and you aren't vibing with that, that's okay, you can always find another person. You gotta find the right person that vibes with you.
Yeah. But in that as well, yeah, then they are also there to act as a support. And
Yeah.
that's where that training and this space of um the practitioner like holding that grounded space within themselves and that centered space, they get to pick up on what's coming up in your system. I know a lot of the time when I'm leading
Mhm,
sessions and it goes into like a more emotional space, like I will literally end up holding onto the space around my heart. I've ended up like not sobbing
mhm,
crying while a client's talking about their experience, but I'll have tears shed
mhm.
because there is that empathy going on, and like my body will end up mirroring what's going on with their posture, but that gives me information about
Mhm.
what they're experiencing. But I know
Yeah,
how to hold that as a practitioner and somebody who's been through a wide variety of training practices, um, to be able to bring them to a regulated space while maintaining my own regulation. And that's
yes.
really important. And that again is this space of modeling for you that
Mhm,
like there can be that openness
mhm,
in a relationship, that
mhm.
you can be present with whatever your experiences were. Nobody can tell you what those were or weren't. They will try. I've had many
Oh,
people
of
throughout my
course.
life try to tell me what my experiences
Oh, yeah.
were, and for a long time I believed them.
Mhm.
But that doesn't make it your truth, it makes it their truth.
I also wanna branch off, of that, we also can do that to ourselves.
Mhm. Yes.
Like, in my specific case, I had for many years, I wasn't cognizant of the fact that I was in a very abusive relationship, for years, and it was a choice, and in that time, I was struggling through cancer, and so unconsciously and consciously, I justified all of the abuse because I needed somebody, because I was sick and I was dying, and I needed someone. So I created my own personal hell for myself, and there was a lot of shame that I created. No one else was telling me like, "Oh, it's your fault. You stayed in that relationship." No one else was telling me that. But no matter how many times people said to me, it's completely understandable with your situation and the circumstances that was going on that you didn't feel safe to leave.
Mhm.
No matter how many times people said that, it always came back into me. Shame, shame, shame. I'm a horrible person. I did
Yeah.
this to myself. And it took me years to even just validate myself to acknowledging that that was an abusive relationship. I was being abused and I chose to be there.
Well, and that's there, especially when it comes to marriage, right? But it can happen with just partner relationships or
Mhm.
even work relationships and stuff like that. Um, the shame of staying or going, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. It goes both ways for sure.
Yeah, well, and especially around marriage because there's so much stigma placed around the idea of divorce
Yeah.
and all these feelings that come up of failure and lack of worthiness and all the things
Mhm.
when that space ends.
Mhm.
Um, but again, that wasn't that was a serving relationship at one point in time, the way I look at it now is
Yeah. Yeah.
when it ended, it was no longer a serving relationship for you. And so that's
Mhm.
where you both
Yeah.
needed to go your separate ways.
Yeah.
Um, one of the bigger points though that I love that you brought up, and because it reflects so much back to what I kept noticing over the
Mhm.
last week, was that space of bringing it back to the self blame and shame,
Mhm.
whether
Yeah.
staying or going,
Yeah.
but also for me to have stayed in those spaces of relationship. And believe me, it was a very subconscious and unconscious level that I was doing this, was how abusive I was being to myself,
Mhm.
and especially in thinking that I deserved any of that treatment,
Mhm.
in thinking
And
that I deserved to be like demeaned or talked down to
mhm.
as a partner. Like that's, let alone any of the other stuff that happened in those spaces. But there was a level of feeling like I deserved it.
Mhm. Oh, yeah. For me, the word deserve may not, like, may not be the one I would use from my personal experience.
Mhm,
Um, it was I justified and questioned. So I knew, even consciously, that I didn't deserve any of that. But I rationalized that treatment that I was getting from this other person that I knew I didn't deserve.
mhm.
I justified it even for
Yeah.
myself. And it also was like, oh, I know I don't deserve this, but like maybe if I hadn't done that one thing, he wouldn't have yelled at me about that or this or that. And in my situation, um, and I apologize if this triggers anybody, I was being severely sexually abused while getting poked and prodded in my vagina for cancer. And so I told myself it's just because I had cancer in my vagina. He wouldn't be doing this if I didn't have that. He wouldn't be abusing me. He wouldn't be stepping out and, all of that. And so it wasn't that I felt that I deserved it, but I was rationalizing and giving excuses as to
Mhm,
why I was tolerating it. And
yeah.
that's both of what we just said are very, very common.
Mhm.
And sometimes it's an amalgamation of both.
Yeah, no, and that's, I would say with mine, there was that level as well, right?
Mhm.
That's,
Mhm.
I do
Definitely.
wanna clarify, because there's physical abuse, verbal abuse, there's emotional abuse, there's mental abuse, there's financial abuse, there's
Mhm.
spiritual abuse. Like,
Mhm.
you can experience abuse in so many different spectrums, not in, I didn't even list off sexual abuse in there, right?
Yeah.
Um, but in that, like, my personal biggest instance, or the thing I considered my biggest personal instance of physical abuse, was the one time I ever had a partner, like, um, fully lay hands on me.
Mhm.
And in that situation, um, he had been very blatantly lying. And it was me asking him, like, I wasn't yelling at him or anything like that. I was asking him, like, why he was lying. And he jumped across a coffee table at me and used a jujitsu move to put me on the floor and then proceeded to sit on my chest. In that, he then proceeded to tell me to hit him. And thankfully, some part in my head went, he wants a reason to hit you. Just get him off you. And,
Mhm.
but in that space, after that moment of time ended, there was waves of confusion, waves of anger, waves of shock going through my
Mhm.
system, because I had no idea what just happened. It seemed so out of alignment compared to what our relationship had been.
Mhm.
But at the same time, there was still that space of me being like, well, I shouldn't have asked the question.
Yeah.
And I would say a lot of the abuse, like when I look back at my own experience of it, has come up around me using my voice,
Yeah.
right? Where I'm asking a question somebody doesn't like I'm not asking that to be judgmental or critical or whatever it is. And even
Mhm.
when I look at the way I'm forming those questions, right? It wasn't, well, you did this and like pointing the finger, but something snaps in that person's
Mhm.
system and then they lash out. And
Yeah.
that's from their own trauma and stuff. But I also recognize now I don't have to hold them in those spaces of trauma, right? Because that
Yeah.
is where I kept subjecting myself to abuse over time is it was their pain is worse. I can handle this. I can take on their pain, like,
Yeah.
so they get better.
Mhm.
I can
And
give them their chance, right?
right. Yeah. And
That's
it's
it,
in it.
savior complex.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I've been there. Oh yeah. And even in the relationship that I've been speaking about, I was there too. It was the savior complex as well as a victim complex in a sense. For I would think to myself, once I have the surgery, he'll see that it's real and that he should treat me better.
Mhm.
And that never came.
Yeah.
And I was also thinking about it since we mentioned somatics earlier, and you just mentioned the loss of your voice. For me, in that relationship and its abuse and what I was struggling with through cancer, the stress of everything, I did not voice anything. I shut up.
Mhm.
Speaking would get me more abused, so I wouldn't speak. And through that, my jaw locked shut. And I had to start seeing doctors for that. And through all of that, there was also an abuse of the doctor relationship. Just as being a woman, they weren't looking for the right things. It took 2 years for them to figure out that I even had cancer. And
Mhm.
within that abuse that was going on, everyone that I was speaking to was denying every truth that I had to utter out of my body or out of my mouth. That use my voice and to speak my truth, and everyone was saying your truth's a lie, basically.
Yeah.
And so that somaticized very physically for me to the point that I couldn't open my mouth. And that was not. I do want to clarify for anyone that was not a mental block. So there is conversion disorder, which is you're mentally creating it and it's not really there. A good example of a conversion would be a hysterical pregnancy, where you want a baby so badly that you start having all of the symptoms of pregnancy without there actually being a fetus within your womb. Somaticization is very real. So if you're feeling like women carry a lot of anxiety and pain and stress in their kidneys. You very much are having a kidney infection in that moment. You need to get antibiotics. This is not, oh, I need to just calm down my brain to fix the problem. So somaticization it's like a catch 22. Your brain is so terrified and stressed and this or that, so many emotions are going on that it creates a physical illness within your organs. And then that illness that you have in your organs creates more stress in the brain, which amplifies the physical reaction that's going on too. So I do hope that helps clarify a little bit about what somaticization and trauma can do to the body. And in my instance, I had to go to doctors and I had to basically pry open my mouth. And I had to start figuring out things to do for my mental health as well. And what I ended up doing in that instance was acupuncture
Mhm.
and meditation. But I think it was 2 years ago when I met you that I finally started working on my voice.
Oh, yeah, our sessions were very specifically around your beautiful voice, my dear.
Oh, thank you. Yes, exactly. Yeah, and that was when it, like, truly began, and it came to me, me not speaking up anymore.
Yeah.
My jaw literally locked shut,
Well, and
and
that's
that
oh,
mhm.
go ahead.
I was just gonna say that is how the abuse was manifesting in my body for me.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would say, like, I have noticed, and it's that repeated narrative that keeps coming back around, um, that so when I was a little kid, there was a lot of bullying from one of my siblings,
Mhm,
and I would try to speak up about it. That's one of my parents had predominantly taught me, okay, um, like, here are some tools on how to resolve your own issues. But if you and this other kid, especially, can't resolve those issues, then come find an adult. And
mhm,
so when I would go to visit my other parent, and in that space I had siblings, um, things would happen with this sibling, and I wouldn't know how to handle it. Like, I was not used to that level of sibling rivalry, and I would
mhm,
try to speak up for myself. I would then receive punishment from the sibling for not giving them the answer they wanted. I would get kicked out of bed in the middle of the night. My mom's told me stories since then about how I got a hold of her crying because I got whipped with a hose, things like that. Um,
mhm,
and I did not know how to stand up in that space. Again, anger had become very unsafe. Like, I did not want to lash out and hit another person.
mhm.
So I would go to an adult. And a lot of the times in that, it would come back with, oh, deal with your own problems. Right. And in that, it was those repetitive spaces of being taught to shut down my voice, to
Mhm,
not speak about what those pains were or what the problems were I was
mhm,
experiencing. And that came up again and again, but repeated in more blatant ways in the relationships I had as an adult, right? That's I was asking that partner who jumped across the table at me why he was lying because the lies were so blatant. It was
yeah,
actually a little ridiculous for how blatant they were, and I was just confused. And but in that, it's because I asked a question, right? Another point in time, and granted, for most of my life, I have identified as being straight, so these experiences are with male partners.
mhm,
But in that space, like one of the times I was being name called in front of my son. And
mhm,
granted, he's still very young age, but I'm not okay with that. So I spoke up for
mhm,
myself. And there's a sequence that happens where it's me speaking up, the person rushing towards me and getting like very close in proximity to me, right? To where they're able to touch me, reach me, whatever
mhm.
it is. But it's a threatening body display
Yeah.
from the other person. like chest puffed up, I always think of like a gorilla. If you think about
Oh
a
yeah,
gorilla who's
pounding
like
their
in
chest.
attack
Yeah.
mode, yeah. Um, but like that that puffing of the chest, the shoulders back, making themselves look bigger
Mm-hmm.
because they're not liking what my voice had to carry. And that doesn't make it okay for them to try to shut that down.
Yeah.
And that's coming back again to like your experience is what it is. And those people, those abusers may not be able to accept that,
Mm-hmm.
but that's okay. Like you can find people who can accept that, who can hold that space for you,
Mm-hmm.
and who can love you in it, right? And who, like, if a situation comes up, you can talk to them about it and they will be receptive and
Mm-hmm.
notice, oh, like, yeah, I can understand why this was scary for you, and bring that
Mm-hmm.
self-awareness to them for how they're interacting with you.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
maybe I'm sure they have subconscious and unconscious patterns that stemmed from their own abusive modeling that they
Mm-hmm.
received that
Yeah.
told them this thing.
Yeah. I also want to mention, it took me years and degrees educating myself first, um, to really understand that there are some people you can ask why to, like in
Mhm.
your case, why are you lying? And there are some people you can't. And that's difficult, especially in the heart and the psyche when you love this person, you've built a relationship with them, and you have, finally realized that there isn't that freedom to speak. And I've been there, and unfortunately in multiple different relationships, and it took multiple different relationships for me to learn sometimes I don't get a why. I don't get an answer to my why. And I had to ask myself the very difficult question: do I need an answer? Do I need to know why? I'm aware of the truth. They're aware that I know the truth. Whether or not they admit it or not, I could have, receipts of some kind that are, proof, and they'll still be like, oh, it's fabricated or something like that. And I had to sit myself down and say, what inside of me needs this? And also, is that a need that will serve me in my future, in my healing, in my current situation with my partner? Or should I just get up from the table and no longer sit there?
Yeah.
And that was really hard for me. And I somaticize a lot of my pain and my emotions. And I remember getting very sick, like, head colds, bladder infections, all the lovely things that come up when you're in transformation, because it was rooted down to my body, to locking my jaw shut, that I needed answers. I needed validation from them. I needed them to admit to me that they were bad, that they did me wrong. And unfortunately, we don't always get that.
No,
And
and when it
especially
comes
when
to abuse, you usually
yeah.
don't.
And yeah, exactly. I was about to say that. And in abusive relationships, that could very well be the hardest thing to let go of before you're able to even leave. And
Mhm.
that is what happened for me in my marriage. Is at one point I woke up one morning And I knew at some point in the near future my husband was going to kill me. And the first thing that I said to myself, well, why? And then my body wanted to go and ask him, why are you being this way? Why are you hurting me? Why, like, we should talk about this because I'm having this fear. And I was just like, I cannot. The
Mhm.
moment that I ask him is the moment that I will die. And I made the decision. It took me 3 months after making that decision to actually leave my situation. So I hope anyone who's listening doesn't feel that, like, the moment you realize you need to leave your abusive relationship or marriage, it does not necessarily mean that it's going to happen overnight.
No.
And in most cases, it doesn't. And I was lucky that I made it out in 3 months after making my decision. But it still took me a year before that to just come to the, acceptance that I was being abused. And sorry, I just got the sun in my eye and lost my train of thought. Um, but you choosing to stop needing to ask why in an abusive relationship is difficult and very important.
I also think there's
Hmm.
importance in pointing out that the space on focusing so much outside of yourself
Hmm.
can also be a trauma response,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
So not only in the extent like as far as indicators you can see is that oh like you're constantly like experiencing drama in
Hmm.
your life,
Hmm.
right? Or that it's always his fault, their fault, whoever else's fault. But in that constantly really wanting to understand your partner's perspective,
Hmm.
and especially if they're not willing to share,
Mm.
um,
Hmm.
but needing to know those root reasons why. Like my question is, how much are you asking yourself similar sorts of questions,
Oh, I love that. Yes,
right?
exactly.
So if you're asking why they took this action, right?
Mhm.
And I don't typically like why questions in general. I like the what's and how's.
Mhm.
Um, but in that, like, what is the question for you that would be important? Why are you staying there? What are you
Yeah.
gaining by staying in a relationship with that person? What needs are
Mhm.
being fulfilled? Like, or how are they being fulfilled? That's making it safer to be there than to not be.
Mhm. And I do wanna point out, since we're talking about abuse, it's okay if you come up, if you ask yourself, "Why am I here?" And
Mhm.
your first thought is, "Because I'm scared to leave."
No.
That's a valid reason to stay. And so that's the first step towards to figuring out how to get out in a safe way. Once
Well,
you
or how
realize that what? I'm sorry?
oh, I was just gonna say, or how you need to readjust in your own relationship
Mhm.
because that's not all those spaces of abuse are going to lead to the end of a relationship,
Yeah.
right? Um, like those, there are people who are willing to work with you. I'm gonna say, if like
Mhm.
your partner is hitting you, like there is imminent physical abuse,
Mhm.
please get yourself to safety. Like,
Yes.
I don't care if you have like 5 dogs, 10 kids, whatever it is. Like, there are programs and people, like, if
And
your
phone number
life is in
call.
imminent harm, get
Mhm.
yourself out as
Yes.
soon as possible.
Yes.
But if you're willing to work with the other layers of abuse, and your partner is willing to work with you. That is a
Mhm.
key
Mhm.
point. Like, they are willing to actually take accountability for their actions,
Mhm. Yeah.
then, like, you might have a relationship that can be repaired. It may end up being that you guys do some of this healing work together and you find, okay, like, we're not actually a great match as well, but
Mhm.
it needed a little bit longer and there was some healing space
Mhm.
that was able to happen there.
Yeah. There's
But
also,
yeah, go
sorry,
ahead.
interrupt you. I was just gonna say there's also the space of when both parties are, victims of past abuse in some way in their past relationships, but also we all have some form of childhood trauma or, things that we're struggling with that we have to unlearn as adults.
Mhm,
And your trauma can actually be projected out onto other people, and that is abusive. It's toxic um, communication.
mhm.
And if you're not aware that you're doing that, you're not intentionally trying to be about abusive or toxic to that person. So it's perfectly possible that your partner is completely unaware that they're being abusive to you.
Yes.
And so you can work through that with them. And it could be vice versa. You both are, victims of, some sort of abuse in the past, and it comes out in your fears in your current relationship that, those things are going to happen again, whether they're happening or not. Um,
Well, and
so
we've
you're
we've
completely
mentioned it
correct. Yeah.
we've mentioned it before, it's a hard pill to swallow, right?
Mhm.
But you're in a relationship, right?
Mhm.
With these situations,
Mhm.
you and your partner both had your parts to play.
Exactly.
Like, even if they are the one who is immensely abusive, like, you had your part to play in that too. That does not mean that you deserved it or that you need to keep taking it or anything else.
Or that you created that for yourself. Like if they're
Yeah,
hitting you and you're telling yourself, "Oh, I deserve to be hit." No.
no.
The only thing you really created there was being in that space. You were
Mhm.
present for that transgression to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, the
But
the
it does
bigger
not
thing
mean that
after
you
that
are
is
yeah. Yes,
i-
sorry.
is
Go on.
that deciding to stay, and especially if
Mhm.
you guys aren't going through the healing work around that.
Mhm. Both of you together. It can't be one
Mhm.
or the other. Like if you're getting therapy or you're working with a coach or a healer of some kind and your other partner is not, there is no balance to that.
Mhm.
So you'll end up being a car with only two wheels on one side. You can't drive that.
Yeah, and we've mainly talked about partner relationships here, but
Mhm.
relationships is a very broad term and can come
Yeah.
back to family as well.
Mhm. Or
Um,
friendships as well. Mhm.
Family, friends, peer groups, work,
I
like,
threw
can.
in doctors as well.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
Mhm.
definitely. It's,
Mhm.
to me, I can have a relationship with anyone, right? It
Yeah.
may be a 5-minute relationship where we're passing each other on the street or even a 30-second relationship, right?
Mhm.
But points of making connection with people to me are a form of relationship. And that's that very zoomed
Mhm.
out perspective of what that is versus just romantic. But it doesn't matter if you've been in a marriage for 20 years. It doesn't matter if it's your biological family, right? It doesn't matter where that relationship stemmed from. If it's a place where the people you're in relationship with aren't willing to work with you and like you're needing those people to work with you,
Mhm.
like, it is okay to let go of those relationships.
Yeah.
And that can be family, friends, partners, work,
Yeah.
whatever it is.
Mhm. And that includes parents, you guys.
Yes, very much so. And
And
that is what
grandparents,
stems that
uncles,
from you.
siblings, all of it. It also as parents, or speaking to parents, I'm not a parent, I apologize.
Hmm.
It could also be your kids.
Yeah. Yeah, very much so.
Mhm.
That's um, after my marriage ended. I only went to one of the meetings, but it was Al-Anon, so it's for the codependents,
Mm.
um, or not Al-Anon, whatever the codependent version of that is, like where it's the people who are in relationships with alcoholics. Um,
Mhm.
but there was a lot of people in that specific meeting where they were parents to children who were alcoholics, and them talking about having to set appropriate boundaries for themselves around the ways that they're there to support their kids, because that can become an abusive relationship as well.
Mhm.
And being a parent, like, and granted my son is still very young, but like I don't tolerate abuse with him. I talk to him about it. I mean, that's he will totally try to hit or kick me if he gets flared at certain times.
Mhm.
And it's frustrating as a parent for sure. Um, but it's those create the learning opportunities.
Yeah.
So I know you usually need to get going around 2. Did you have anything else you wanted to touch on?
Nothing is coming to mind immediately. I don't feel like I said everything that I had planned on saying, but that's
Mhm.
okay.
Yeah,
There'll be other opportunities.
exactly.
Mhm. I do want to urge, anyone who's listening, if you feel connected by anything that myself or Alex has said today, to reach out to us and either, message us or give us a call. And we can see that if we're able to help you get into a space that you want to be in your life right now.
Yeah, no, that's there's a lot of resources for
Mhm.
moving through abusive spaces in
Mhm.
relationships. Um, that's under the About section on YouTube. You can find links to contact either Rachel Rose or myself. Um, through my link specifically, if you go to my website, I have a whole list of resources on there of a whole bunch of different books. And I have
Mhm.
them broken out into categories. And these have been some of my top books that I've gone through that fell
Mhm.
into each of those different areas. And there's definitely pieces on there with abuse in relationships, trauma,
Mhm.
and communication,
Yeah.
especially. But yeah, it's if you're finding that you want help, even if you're not sure what that help needs to be for you yet, like please feel free to reach out to Rachel Rose or myself.
Mhm.
And that's, I know for me, even if you're not feeling called to work with me, we have pools of resources. Like
Yes.
we
Yeah.
have contacts of people who may be better aligned to work with you. And I'm
Mhm.
happy to share those and happy to help make connections. I'm also more than happy to hold that space for clients.
Mhm. And if you're not, feeling ready to seek out help quite yet, I do have a Facebook group called The Empowered Woman. That is, just a support group. So if you feel alone in what you're struggling with and you want community, you are more than welcome to join that community and have a safe space of solidarity in what's happening to you. And you can just, talk to other women that have gone through it too.
Yeah, and that's I know most of this conversation has been based around the the receiving of abuse from male populations. Like, please be aware
Oh,
that men receive abuse in relationships as well.
and also
Um,
if you're in a same-sex relationship,
yes.
that can also it exists there too. It's just a party of 2
Hmm. Yeah.
or more sometimes, but usually a party of 2.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Mhm,
so, like, please don't exclude yourself from being able to connect with the spaces that have happened in this conversation.
mhm,
Just realize it's being led by two women, one who very specifically focuses on working with women. And
mhm,
I branch and work with men and women, but I've also held that space for a lot of men who have needed to find that processing through their own
mhm,
trauma and their own beliefs and narratives and things like that that have stemmed from not only receiving abuse in younger ages and through their relationships, but also like in witnessing what was modeled for them in dynamics with
mhm.
their parents. So,
Yeah, yeah,
all right, beautiful. I think that
perfect.
closes us out for the day. Thank you, as
Mhm.
always, Rachel Rose, for
Yeah,
joining
thank
me.
you.
And we will be back next Thursday at 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And the topic will be announced. That was not decided ahead of time.
Yeah.
So,
We'll announce that by Monday of next week for anyone who's
yes,
listening.
yes,
Mhm.
beautiful. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. And thank you, as always, Rachel Rose.
Yes, same goes for you. Thank you so much, and everyone have a great afternoon. Enjoy the spring.
Bye.
Bye.